Hello guys, how are we doing? Sorry it's taken me so long to do this, but we've got there in the end. Been doing a lot of fannying around and trying to get this perfect, but nothing is ever perfect, is it, as we know. So I also did do one with a video, so you could see my face, but apparently we're not allowed those. So anyway, I'm going to stop rambling and get into this. So I'll try and keep this as brief as I can. And as succinct as I can. This is the last interpretation you did, and I asked you what you wanted, or what you needed, or you thought you needed to improve. The only reply I got was from Samia. Dawood replied as well, but mentioning that he just needed more practice. That's fine. But Samia said that she wanted to, more direction on the structure. So structure is what we're looking at today. So just to remind us again, this was the interpretation. It took into account Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II. So requiring you to sort of use a great deal of knowledge. And I'm going to be looking at these two arguments here, the top two. I'm going to assume that you can remember this. If you can't, of course, you can pause this and read this. But I'm going to focus on the top two here. So, this first line, as we often get in interpretations, that the Great Reforms should be seen as the last and most successful achievements of autocracy. I've got an add here, I've remembered, from above. I know we probably all know this, but just so we can be really clear, if something is from above, then that is driven by usually a government or whoever is ruling, or whoever is in power. And if something is from below, then it is pushed from beneath to make change. You will probably see these terms used very much throughout your educational career, especially if you do history. I'm almost certain if you do another humanity. Anyway. Let's get into it then. So the first one was that the Great Reform should be seen as the last and most successful achievements from above. And the second, which we pulled out in class, is that between the Great Reforms and the reforms post-1905, so Stolypin's land reforms, etc., along with the October Manifesto, that there was no meaningful reform from above, as Alexander III and Nicholas II were mainly interested in repression instead of active progress. I've used active progress here because I kind of wanted to make clear that the Tsars were doing work that was for the benefit of society, and not just to shield autocracy from major changes, which we kind of know they did, didn't we? I've got a couple here as well that we could have looked at. That on a more general thing, that the Great Reforms were pushed from above, whilst the reforms from 1905 were mainly from below. Obviously, we could maybe take issue with this one if we were going to talk about this, with whether, maybe not pushed, but whether Alexander II was, actually wanted them to happen. So yes, they happened from above, and also again here, maybe, was Stolypin's reforms all about, responding to pressure from below? Not too sure. And a similar one here before. But anyway, I'm not going to ramble anymore. Let's get into this. So, structure. So a lot of you, I saw happening in your last ones was a kind of following maybe a sort of more politics style with this, where you would say why it was convincing and have a whole paragraph about why it was convincing, and then a separate paragraph saying why it was not convincing. That is essentially what we're doing, but we need to put them in the same paragraph, and we need to be justifying justifying the order that we put them in. So let's start with this one then. So the Great Reforms should be seen as the last most successful achievements of autocracy from above. So always need to do this. Why is it convincing? Why is it not convincing? how does it corroborate? So how does it back up your knowledge that makes you think, yeah, I think this is good. I'm persuaded by this. How is it actually lacking where you can think, maybe I can, pull at this a bit here. Again, point worth mentioning here: you do not get any marks for, pulling off some wonderful, amazing takedown of a historian. That's not what they want. They want you to look at what's in front of you and to sort of, in a very considered way, pick it apart. This isn't. You're not trying to impress anybody here. The way in which you will impress somebody is by utilising your knowledge and making a really solid claim. So, is this convincing? Great reforms should be seen as the last and most successful achievements from above. Well, yeah, in general, I think it is convincing because, as we've said, as we know, there isn't really anything to rival these reforms in terms of the magnitude, so the size of these changes. There were little bits and bobs, but nothing really, to challenge them. So yeah, I think that's good. But on the other hand, were they a success? As we all know, not really. They created massive divisions in a society that was already very stratified. As I put here, they were essentially a hash, weren't they? They could have been a lot better than they were. So I'm going to be picking on here most successful to sort of balance it. But I'm going to generally be saying here that yeah, I am convinced by this to a point, but it's lacking. So, structure. Always want to open with exactly what the argument is. So, the first argument put forth by Perrie is that the great reforms of Alexander II from 1861 onwards were the last and most successful progressive and creative act in Russian history. Ooh, that's a very long sentence. I would like that to be shorter, actually, but we haven't got time. As I've been seeing in some of your essays as well, I used to do it, but try to keep your sentences short if they start to ramble. Maybe I could learn that for myself speaking, but so we've identified the argument. That's always the most critical point here. If you don't identify an argument properly, you can't get any marks because you can't. If you just say what's in the thing in the interpretation again, it's not going to work. So the next thing you need to do, always, which some of you didn't in the last one that I read, is you need to put your judgment down here at the start. And that's the same, for a paragraph in an essay or even in, as your argument in an overall introduction. Because if you do not put this element here, then you can't prove anything. And that's ultimately what we're always doing in history, is we're always making a judgment and then essentially using examples to prove that. So this is my overall response here to this argument. This argument is convincing to a great extent. So, I'm saying, yeah, I'm really on the side of this, although only to a degree. So it's missing certain points. Now, why is it convincing to a... Oh, the speaker just turned up. Why is it convincing only to a great extent? Well, as I've said before, there were no other policies put forwards during the reigns of both Alexander III and Nicholas II that could match the scale and magnitude of Alexander II's reforms. So again, I've just put in here some, as we would want to see, some facts, some statistics. You can see I've got lots of numbers here, which is what any examiner is immediately looking for. I've got a Vera Zasulich here. And so I'm playing up to this side. I'm saying, yeah, these were big changes. We had this, the peasantry for the first time gaining these rights. I've used here educational and judicial reforms. Just to sort of follow up here, you could have used obviously military or, well, I guess military's only the other one, but other social changes. And I've just quickly, peppered it here. So major developments such as allowing women to attend universities and the introduction of juries at court. This latter development is most famously remembered with the case of Vera Zasulich. Don't need to go into massive detail, but I've played up to that side. I think, yes, these were, progressive to a great degree. But here's when we're going to put the twist in. Here's where we're going to get the balance. Yet to call these reforms successful is somewhat an overstatement, as this does take away from the strength of her argument. So, I'm making another little judgment here, my sort of claiming voice that's coming in the paragraph. So how am I going to back myself up here then to challenge her? Well, as we already know, the sort of facts that should be quite well tamped down in our minds right now is, as we know, peasants had to pay redemption payments, 43 years, as we all know, less land, so therefore crippled by debt and lack of food, and that the nobility didn't benefit either. I would have liked some statistics here, but I didn't have time. I also could have put here, mentioned if I wanted to, about Alexander II's sort of direction of this. So putting it onto his nobles, and that being why, or his government, to sort of drive this, and that's why it was, weren't a success. But either way, I've gone for one side. So my judgment here, knowledge to back myself up from one side, put the little twist in the middle to balance it out. But then I've gone back to my overall argument at the end. Therefore, in general, this claim is very convincing. Yet by calling them successful on a more specific level, so I've sort of, a cute thing you could do is balance the general over the specific. On a more specific level, it does not quite account for the nature of the great reform substantially enough. So that completely fits with what I said here. It had great extent, got very convincing, similar sort of thing, although only to a degree, and then I've, again, just sort of summarised what that means there. Alright, how are we doing for time? 12 minutes, okay. I'll do the next one quickly. Similarly then, so between the Great Reforms and the reforms post-1905, there was no meaningful reform from above, as Alexander III and Nicholas II were mainly interested in repression instead of active progress. Okay, so I'm going to do this in a slightly different way here, but so why is this convincing? Well, as we know, both rulers were heavily autocratic, so, in general, yes, they weren't focused on progressive reform, were they? They were mainly focused on autocratic, preserving autocracy. Why is it not so convincing, though? Well, again, if this is suggesting that there was nothing from above, then we can pick her up on that. And I do think that even though these are finance ministers here, that I'm going to be using Bunga, but Bunga did put forward some reforms which were were very much progressive and had great effects. So similar thing then. So second argument identified, pulling out the argument. Another note as well, if you're talking about different people, you might want to find some different ways of talking about them. So I've said Alexander II's son and grandson here, and then here, for example, Alexander II's successors. Different ways of saying the same thing. Good writing uses variety. Just a side point. But so identified the argument, and then I've made my claim. This argument is also relatively convincing, but up to a point. So very similar to the one above. Both of these are quite balanced. So I'm going to take it on the other side here, actually, and challenge it. So it fails to recognise some of the achievements of government during Alexander II's successors. I've used Bunga. I've talked about the creation of land banks. So that was a progressive policy to improve life for the peasants. And I've also mentioned his labour laws, also in the 1880s, and how they provided a foundation for workers' rights. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this under 15 now. Probably won't get there, but similarly in the middle here, I'm going to switch it around again. So I bring back in my sort of voice, talking about my argument, talking about my judgment. However, Perrie is in general correct to identify that Alexander III and his son were predominantly interested in repression instead of reform. Easy examples here, as a lot of you gave, if you picked up on this one, but Russification, censorship, and I mentioned Nicholas II's senseless dreams comment about how liberal opposition wanted constitutional reform, and he obviously just completely shut that down from the start of his reign. So give my knowledge there, and then at the end, as a result, then argument is on the whole convincing, but it does contain some minor drawbacks. I've gone a little bit over for what I wanted. I hope that that's been clear for you. These are both, like I said, quite balanced. You might have ones like we see with the essays where it's really very much convincing. There's not a lot that you can balance in there, and that's fine. But either way, you always need to identify the argument. You always need to make a judgment about that argument at the start, about how convincing it is, and then usually going to have a bit of balance. I would say 90% of the time. And even if you can't, it would be good to say how it's difficult to argue against something. And then, again, just tying it up at the end. And just so to remind us, obviously, this would be... this would be all on the same... all on the same, and so a whole essay of this would be basically two more of these. So each one of these you want to see is its own little essay essentially, but you can see that it's exactly the same sort of structure I've used for both of them. Anyway, 16 minutes, 16 and a half. I'll try and be a bit more like I said, precise next time, but stay tuned, there'll be more to come, and I hope that you guys are really are doing okay. I miss you all very much, and yeah, see you soon.